He's owned the Post since 2013, and the implication that many people are assuming, or the inference that they're drawing, is that Bezos does not want to have an endorsement of Kamala Harris, which is what the editorial board at the newspaper had been planning to announce. I believe it was going to be on Friday that they were going to endorse Kamala Harris.
That was Matt Kelly. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds, the only podcast that takes a deep dive each week going into a compliance or compliance-related topic into the weeds. Today we take up the leadership or lack thereof from Washington Post owner Jeff Bezos and his refusal to allow the Washington Post to endorse a presidential candidate, overturning 50 years of precedent at the Post and indeed the Post's own guiding principles. It's a fascinating exploration of what leadership is and what all of this means for the compliance professional. Before we get to that, I'd like to have a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network, Ethico.
To your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
And now back to Tom Fox and Matt Kelly. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Today, we're going to take up some leadership lessons or lack thereof from the Washington Post. So, Matt, you want to set the stage?
Sure, Tom. This is news that probably many listeners heard about last week, is that the Washington Post, for the first time in many years, announced that it would not endorse a presidential candidate. And that decision came about, I believe it was on Thursday, 11 days before the presidential election, which of course is quite tight. And one of the candidates there is Donald Trump, who has made no bones about muzzling the free press. So that ruffled a lot of feathers with a lot of people. Since that decision was announced, it has come out that basically this was the decision of the owner of the Washington Post, who is Jeff Bezos, of Amazon fame and Blue Origin and probably several other businesses I don't even know. But Bezos is one of the richest men in the world. He has owned the Post since 2013. And the implication that many people are assuming, or the inference that they're drawing, is that Bezos does not want to have an endorsement of Kamala Harris, which is what the editorial board at the newspaper had been planning to announce. I believe it was going to be on Friday that they were going to endorse Kamala Harris. And at the last minute, Bezos said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to endorse anybody. And everybody else, employees, readers, the public, are inferring from that Bezos did not want to endorse Harris and then have Donald Trump win, and Donald Trump would take aim at Jeff Bezos' many other business interests. So he acted timidly in the face of what could be considerable financial pressure from a potential future Trump administration. And a lot of people have big problems with that when the motto of the paper is democracy dies in darkness. And the whole point of the paper is to be unafraid of holding leaders accountable and expressing opinion on the opinion pages. And that all somewhat unraveled with the Washington Post last week. Since then, as of today, Tom, when you and I are talking on Monday afternoon, the Post has lost about 200,000 subscribers. That is roughly 8% of its subscriber base, and that probably is costing the company about $24 million. If you base that on, it costs about $120 a year to subscribe to the Post. So it is certainly a considerable financial hit to the newspaper. It is an insignificant hit to Jeff Bezos, but there are still a lot of lessons here, regardless of any listeners' particular politics, and I'm sure some of them out there might be Trump supporters. Objectively speaking, there are a lot of lessons here about a company's mission statement, its values, its senior leader, its commitment, the leader's commitment to those values, how to keep stakeholders together and focused on that mission, what happens if all of this goes sideways, because that is what happened at the Post. And here we are.
Matt, could you give our listeners a short tutorial on governance at a newspaper?
Sure. So it works a couple of different ways. Typically, though, you do have an owner who would then hire a publisher who runs the business, and that publisher would then hire an editor who writes up and is in charge of the stuff that you read. Within the editorial team, there are various other functions and departments. There's beats or desks or whatever you want to call them, but there's the sports desk, the news desk, the arts and entertainment desk, and there is also the editorial desk, which specifically writes editorials for the newspaper. Those are opinion pieces that the newspaper publishes. Sometimes an editor signs them. Many times they are not signed. They're just appearing on the op-ed pages. Op means opinion and ed means editorial. So the editorials are just the newspaper's formal view of an issue. Some newspapers do publish editorials that endorse political candidates. I was a newspaper reporter for 5 years at a couple of different newspapers where they didn't do any endorsements of anybody. So it could go either way. The Washington Post in particular had a long history of not endorsing anybody for anything in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when it was owned by the Graham family. But by 1976, it started endorsing every year. It took a year off in 1988 where they specifically said, we are not endorsing anybody this year, but that is not the same as what Jeff Bezos has just done, where he said, we're out of the business of writing presidential endorsements, period. But who actually does it? It is the editorial board. That is like the beat of thinking about opinion stuff. There's probably 6 or 7 different editorial board members at the newspaper for any big metro newspaper. But that is how it works. And they are supposed to be independent so that they can write what they think is correct without any pressure from the publisher or the owner, who might have other financial interests at stake and might want to skew the paper's coverage one way or the other. The whole point of it is that the editorial board gets to call it like they see it. That's their job. That's why they were hired.
Matt, would an editorial be a group writing effort? Would one person draft it and it be circulated? What are the ways you've seen an editorial itself would be created and then published?
So I have seen it where typically the editorial board will gather like once a day. If it's a daily newspaper, they'll talk about what do we want to have an editorial about. Sometimes the whole group will decide we want to issue an editorial on this issue, and then somebody will either volunteer or be assigned to write it. I suppose it might be like a Supreme Court opinion. You know, the justices come and they decide what they're going to write, and then somebody gets to write the opinion. Somebody is assigned to it by the Chief Justice. So you'll have the head of the editorial board will assign somebody, or somebody might volunteer to write the editorial. That draft is then circulated among the editorial board. They might get to comment on it, and then at the end, it gets published. Most usually, the editor, the publisher would not get to see it. The owner would not get to see it. Occasionally, they might get to see it, but they wouldn't have any direct control over it. It would be highly unusual, and hence we are talking about Jeff Bezos right now, for the owner to weigh in and say, no, we're not going to have this. That's typically not how it's done. Yes, they own the paper, so it is their right, but the standard practice now for the better part of 100 years has been the owners own, the publisher runs the business, and the editors write the copy. And the editorial board in particular is the one that writes the copy for editorials, including political endorsements.
Matt, I think you mentioned statement of principles or some other named group of principles that the Washington Post is supposed to follow. Could you tell us those?
I can indeed, because the Post, like any good organization that takes ethics and its purpose seriously, they have a mission statement. And that mission statement was drafted in 1935 when the paper was still owned by its founders. And the 7 principles are still listed on the website today. And here are several of those principles that I think bear light on the current situation. So Principle 5 says, the newspaper's duty is to its readers and the public at large, and not to the private interests of its owners. And Principle 6, in pursuit of truth, The newspaper shall be prepared to make sacrifices of its material fortunes if such course be necessary for the public good. In other words, if you're going to take your mission seriously, and the Washington Post had been right up until last week, then you would take those principles to heart. And therefore, if Jeff Bezos thought that if the Washington Post wanted to endorse Kamala Harris, they should have done it. And they should have done it regardless of whether Jeff Bezos had significant government contracts with the federal government, which he does, and regardless of whether a future Trump administration might then seek to pressure Bezos over his government contracts for what he has written or what his newspaper has written about Trump, which has happened before. Let's not forget that in the prior Trump administration, Amazon was bidding on a large government defense contract for cloud computing because Amazon is one of the largest and best cloud computing services in the world. And the Defense Department didn't want to consider Amazon, largely because Donald Trump didn't like what the Washington Post was saying about Donald Trump. So Amazon did file a lawsuit against the Defense Department over that. Bezos is not wrong to think that Trump might react to negative coverage in the Washington Post by hurting Bezos's other business interests, but that's the price of owning the paper, and a paper with these principles. And if Bezos doesn't want to live up to them, he doesn't have to, but in that case, he should change the principles so everybody can see it, or frankly, he should sell the paper to somebody who would live up to it. And there are numerous other newspapers that have been more than happy to endorse either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, but they're not afraid to issue a presidential endorsement. We should note that the Washington Post, while it was under Bezos' ownership, it endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016. It endorsed Joe Biden in 2020. So why the change now? It's not any big deal for the Post not to endorse Donald Trump. That's already happened 2 times in a row. What is different is Bezos walking away from endorsing presidents entirely. And we should remember, this isn't about we don't do endorsements. There are plenty of newspapers that don't do endorsements. The Post is continuing to do endorsements on a whole lot of other races. It's this particular race. Why? And Bezos has not really explained his thinking. He's created a vacuum, and people have rushed in to speculate, I think with very good grounding, that he's just afraid to speak truth to power.
I would note that as of the date and time of this recording, the New York Times has formally endorsed Kamala Harris via their editorial page. What, if any, failures in leadership do you see directly from this, Matt?
I have been giving that some thought. And like I said, for those of listeners out there who are just saying, this is Matt being a cranky pants because somebody didn't endorse Kamala Harris and Matt hates Donald Trump. For the record, yes, I do not like Donald Trump and I do not endorse him. And radical compliance is not afraid to jeopardize my ability to bid on billion-dollar defense contracts by saying so. But anyways, it's not about the politics here. What it is about is that this is an organization that had a set of principles and it had a job and everybody knew it. And then suddenly the leader of the organization, who is Jeff Bezos, he bought the paper, he contravened those principles. So now everybody is wondering what's going on. The stakeholders of the Washington Post include the employees. It includes the readers. It does include advertisers, but really mostly we're focusing on readers and employees now who bought the Washington Post and who worked at the Post because they believed in that mission. And here comes Jeff Bezos now contravening those principle 5 and 6, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. So these stakeholders now feel betrayed. And this would really be no different than if, say, Rupert Murdoch and Fox News suddenly decided they're not going to support Donald Trump anymore. All of the readers would be up in arms because that's all that Fox News viewers want to do. This is about you have a set of principles and you're violating them. So, that's the leadership lesson. A leader is there to show people the path forward for the organization to follow the mission and the principles that the organization is founded upon. Bezos walked away from that. Everybody is confused. And when he walked away from it, there were still a whole lot of people who said, I like those principles. And if you're going to take the organization in a different way, I'm not going to follow you. including the 200,000 subscribers who have canceled over the last 4 days, including at least 2 employees, high-profile employees at the paper who quit entirely. Several of them quit that editorial board, although they are still with the Washington Post, which I'm not sure how much of a stand on principles that really is, but this was a big thing. And Bezos did not lay any groundwork to tell the stakeholders, we're going to change our principles. He insists that actually he hasn't changed his principles at all. Okay, if that's the case, then please reconcile what you did with what these principles are that you allegedly uphold. And we happen to be talking about Jeff Bezos and political endorsements and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. What I just said would apply to any CEO of any organization. If you contravene the principles and the mission and the values of your business, everybody else there is going to wonder what you're doing. So either you explain it, or they're going to feel like you are no longer in step with the mission. I mean, either the leader isn't, or the leader's yanking the organization in a different direction. And then the stakeholders feel like, I don't have a place here, and I leave. Or there's organizational tension, or people stop taking the organization seriously at all when management says something. Now, let's all think about how often ethics and compliance professionals have we heard people talk about how management talks a good game, but it never actually follows through. And of course, that's terrible because it creates this cynical employee low morale. Well, what did Bezos think he was going to get with an action like this? Of course, the exact same thing is going to happen in his own organization, which happens to be a newspaper. But that sort of behavior, that departure from your commitment to whatever it is your organization believes, that's going to have consequences for the workforce, for other stakeholders, and they're suddenly going to start to question leadership's integrity. And nothing good comes from that. So I'm not at all surprised that the Post is now in a state of disarray. I don't know how they're going to get out of it.
Let me play the lawyer's favorite game of down the slippery slope. We have Bezos pulling a potential endorsement from Vice President Harris for her race for president. It seems to me that the owner could say, we're not going to negatively or cover negative stories about a second Trump administration. Or further down, we're only going to cover positive stories, or we're going to spin stories. Is that just a lawyer's game, or is that a real possibility if you have this sort of owner intervention?
I don't know that how real of a possibility it is, but it is an idea that is now going to take root in people's minds. And if you are an organization, or if you are a leader who wants to take the organization down a certain path, you don't want seeds of doubt to take root in your employees' minds. That, of course, is exactly what is happening at the Post right now. So I don't know. It is worth noting that the Washington Post did an excellent job of covering the Trump administration when Trump was in office before. And they broke excellent stories on the corruption and the ineptitude that was within the Trump administration. So it's not like Bezos couldn't handle that pressure. The Washington Post handled it very well the first time around with Donald Trump, and they did an excellent job in an extremely difficult situation. There's no reason to believe they could not have done that again. But for whatever reason now, Bezos has decided that he's not going to endorse a political presidential candidate, and it seems like an unforced error. We should note, Tom, just to compound this picture here, right after that the news broke that the Post would not be endorsing either candidate, Donald Trump met with executives from the space company Blue Origin. That day, he met with them hours after it was announced that they would not be endorsing Kamala Harris or Donald Trump or anybody else. And Blue Origin is the space company owned by Jeff Bezos. So certainly, I don't think there was any quid pro quo there. I'm willing to bet that meeting had been on the books for days, but it doesn't look good. There is a suspicion of impropriety. There is an appearance of favoritism. And I don't know if that's the first step on your slippery slope or not. You can't rule out the possibility that slope exists. And if you are a leader trying to keep your organization on a path, introducing a slippery slope is not a good way to keep them on the path. That is a good way to get them to fall off the path or to trip over the seeds of doubt that now sprout into weeds of distraction or whatever metaphor we want to use here. But that is the problem that is afoot now with the Post, thanks to Jeff Bezos and his short-sighted actions.
How about simply into the darkness?
Tom, if I could add one other point here, I do think another lesson from all of this with Bezos and the Washington Post is this is a foreshadowing of the same sort of internal tensions that we saw at large organizations in the prior Trump administration and which will come back if he wins again, which is decidedly possible that he might. But how often in the prior Trump administration did we see businesses go through immense turmoil with their workforce, with their customers, with consumers at large, because the business was doing business with the Trump administration and people didn't like that. So there was turmoil. What's happening at the Post is not exactly like that, but clearly it reminds everybody large businesses had a terrible time dealing with the Trump administration in the first 4 years. I will give you an example is that Salesforce, they were giving cloud computing and technology resources to Customs and Border Patrol back in 2018. That led to a huge uproar and calls for boycotting Salesforce and whatnot, which I don't think anybody actually did. But that is not the sort of thing that the CEO, Mark Benioff, who actually is a large Democratic supporter, that is not something that he needed back in 2018. In 2019, Wayfair, which is a furniture retailer online, they run into tremendous pressure because they were selling furniture to be used in Trump detention centers along the border for migrants, which a lot of employees did not like, a lot of customers did not like. These employees and customers found each other on social media. They led to Wayfair boycotts. There was an employee walkout, and I remember that well because Wayfair is based in Boston. I happened to be walking by the offices when they had the walkout in 2019. So it's that sort of internecine strife is going to resurface at large organizations when they start dealing with the Trump administration if Donald Trump comes back, which I hope he doesn't, but he might. And for everybody who says that's the job, and if employees don't like it, they can quit, think about how that works for a lot of companies, because there were employees at Amazon that did not like working on defense contracts for the Trump administration. What was Jeff Bezos supposed to do there? Tell his best and brightest coders, if you don't like it, you can get another job? They would be having recruiters paging them before they reached the parking lot. Or with the CEO of Wayfair, who was no paragon of leadership, in my humble opinion, he basically said, this is the company I run, this is how I want to run it, and we're going to keep on doing it. Wayfair's share price during that walkout in 2019, $160. Wayfair's share price today, $40. Not very good. There are many ways that stakeholder groups will find that they are in disagreement with you in a potential Trump administration, and that's going to tie companies in the knots, and it's not going to be good. I'm not necessarily saying that's the only reason why the Trump administration might be problematic. Maybe it's going to be great. I don't know. But nonetheless, these are the problems that companies need to start anticipating right now, because if another Trump administration comes around, it's going to be a repeat of the first one. And there's going to be a lot of people who have big problems with it, and they are employees, they are consumers, they are shareholders, and they're going to wonder whether a company doing business in a Trump world, is that in comportment with the company's ethical values or not? And Washington Post is clearly struggling mightily with that. Jeff Bezos is struggling mightily with that. We're going to see variations on that theme in a second Trump administration if one comes to pass. And I don't know if one will or won't, but keep in mind that potential scenario.
Simply think of the technical infrastructure needed to deport 1 million immigrants per year.
Yes.
And all of the tech that will be needed.
Yes.
And it's going to take a major tech supplier to do all of that.
How is that supposed to work? What do you tell your Latino employees if you're the tech company providing those sort of services to roundup camps along the southern border? Now, I'll be the first to say that we need better control over our border, but nonetheless, there are a lot of people who will think that detention camps are, as Trump is talking about, that's not the way to go. What are you supposed to do with that workforce if your business is selling to the Trump administration for something like that, or any other number of projects? I suppose there might be scenarios where employees are unhappy to deal with the Harris administration if that one comes to pass. Trump just is the low-hanging fruit. about how we are going to wind up divided and at each other's throats. And that is the sort of thing large organizations are going to struggle with, because we at each other's throats, we forget that actually still just means employees at a large company with a large workforce. It's going to be tough.
On that cheery note, Matt, perhaps we should end this podcast and see what we can come up with next week.
Thank you, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, the sponsor for the entire Compliance Podcast Network is Ethico. And Ethico is offering a free manager's toolkit, which will help your middle managers be a part of a speak up and, equally importantly, listen up culture. We've linked to it in the show notes. It's absolutely free, and it'll be a great way for you to train your middle managers to be a key component of your hotline, of your whistleblower program, of your speak up culture, and equally important, your listen up culture. So check out the Ethico Middle Managers Toolkit. I know you'll find it incredibly useful. If you like Sherlock Holmes or are interested in storytelling in compliance, I hope you will check out Adventures in Compliance, which premieres each Monday on the Compliance Podcast Network. This podcast contains promotional material.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.